It began with a sound, not the sharp crack of a rifle, nor the familiar, sudden crump of a mortar shell. Those were the known sounds of the war, the punctuation marks of daily existence in the jungles of South Vietnam. This was different. It was a sound that did not arrive, but rather materialized. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the earth, a deep, resonant humming that grew not in volume, but in presence. For the soldiers of the 272nd Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army, hidden deep within the supposed sanctuary of War Zone C, it was a profound mystery. They were veterans. They were masters of this terrain. They knew the whine of the F-105 Thunder Chiefs, the womp-womp of the Huey helicopters. They had learned to live with American air power, to burrow beneath it, to wait it out. Their entire strategy was built on patience, on the certainty that the jungle was their greatest ally, an ally that would swallow American technology and frustrate American will. Their supreme commander, General Vong Nguyen Giap, the architect of victory at Dien Bien Phu, had assured them of this. He spoke of the American character, its supposed impatience. The American soldier is not so brave, went the common refrain. Their technology was a crutch. Their reliance on air power was a sign of their unwillingness to fight on the ground, in the mud, where the real war was won. The North Vietnamese cause was a righteous one, fueled by decades of anti-colonial fire and nationalist zeal. There was iron. Their spirit was unbreakable. They would simply endure longer than the Americans were willing to stay. But this sound was not impatient. It was methodical. It was immense. It was the sound of a force that did not need to see them to kill them. High above the triple canopy jungle, flying at an altitude that rendered them invisible and nearly silent, 3 B-52 Stratofortress bombers had just opened their bomb bay doors. They were not aiming for a specific trench, a specific bunker, or a specific soldier. They were aiming for a set of coordinates on a map. They were aiming for a square kilometer of the earth itself. What the soldiers of the 272nd Regiment didn't know, as they looked at the sky and saw nothing, was that they were about to be systematically erased. They were about to become unwilling witnesses to the arrival of a weapon that cared nothing for their ideology, their bravery, or their mastery of the jungle. They were about to learn the ultimate lesson of this new war, that it would not be won by the side with the strongest will, but by the side that could deliver the most tonnage. The weapon that would teach them this lesson was, by the standards of the 1960s, an anachronism. The B-52 Stratofortress was not a product of the Vietnam era. It was a creature of the Cold War's terrifying nuclear logic. Its design brief, issued in the late 1940s, was simple and apocalyptic. Fly 10,000 miles, penetrate the airspace of the Soviet Union, and deliver a city-destroying thermonuclear weapon. It was a massive, 8-engine behemoth, a sublime and terrifying expression of strategic deterrence. It had long, elegant wings that swept back at a gentle 35 degrees and a cavernous bomb bay designed to hold the bulky atomic weapons of the 1950s. It was never meant for a jungle. It was never meant to drop conventional iron bombs on camouflaged infantry. In an age of supersonic fighters and surface-to-air missiles, the big, slow, subsonic B-52 was seen by many in the Pentagon as a lumbering giant, a relic destined for the boneyard. Hotshot fighter pilots in their F-4 Phantoms, streaking low and fast over targets in the north, scoffed at the big, ugly, fat fellow, or Buff, as it was affectionately and crudely known. The war in Vietnam was supposed to be a counterinsurgency, a war of surgical strikes and limited engagements. Using a strategic nuclear bomber for tactical ground support seemed, to many, like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. It was inefficient. It was overkill. It was absurd. This initial assessment was, in its own way, as flawed as General Giap's belief in the primacy of revolutionary will. Both sides, in the beginning, failed to grasp the true nature of the weapon. The Americans saw it as a clumsy tool, while the North Vietnamese saw all air power as a nuisance to be endured. Both were wrong. The B-52's perceived weakness, its sheer, undiscriminating size and payload would become its greatest and most terrifying strength. It would transform the very landscape of the war, and with it, the psychology of everyone involved. The transformation began on June 18, 1965. The mission was codenamed Operation Arclight. The target was a suspected Viet Cong headquarters in the Ben Cat Special Zone, north of Saigon. 30 B-52 F models, each loaded with 51 750-pound bombs, lifted off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. The flight was a marathon, over 5,000 miles round trip, requiring multiple mid-air refuelings. The mission began as a near disaster. Two of the massive bombers, maneuvering for refueling in the dark over the South China Sea, collided. 8 crewmen were killed. It seemed to confirm every doubt the skeptics had. The weapon was too big, too unwieldy for this kind of war. But for the Viet Cong fighters on the ground, the mission was not a disaster. It was the apocalypse. The bombs did not whistle as they fell. Dropped from over 30,000 feet, they fell for minutes, unseen and unheard, breaking the sound barrier on their way down. The first indication of their arrival was not a sound, but a feeling. The earth began to shudder, then to heave violently, as if in the grip of a localized earthquake. Then came the noise, a deafening, rolling cataclysm of thunder that was not a series of individual explosions, but a single, sustained, earth-shattering roar. A cell of 3 B-52s would drop their loads in a concentrated pattern. Over 150 bombs, totaling more than 50 tons of high explosives, would saturate a box roughly 1 mile long and half a mile wide. Within that box, the world simply ceased to exist. The jungle was not burned or cratered. It was pulverized. Triple canopy trees, hundreds of feet tall, were reduced to splinters. The very ground was churned, plowed, and liquefied. A Viet Cong survivor later described it. The bombing was terrifying. The ground rocked and swayed, and it felt as if we were on a boat in a rough sea. The noise was deafening, and the air was filled with a huge cloud of red dust. We could not see anything. It was like the end of the world. For those caught just outside the box, the effect was almost as devastating. The concussion wave could collapse lungs. The vacuum created by the massive fireballs could suck the air from underground bunkers, asphyxiating those inside. Soldiers were driven mad by the sheer sensory overload, a condition that became known as B-52 shock. They would be found wandering aimlessly, deafened, bleeding from the nose and ears, their minds shattered by an experience their brains could not process. The cognitive dissonance was profound. North Vietnamese doctrine was built around the concept of the untouchable sanctuary. The jungle was their shield. Deep, interconnected tunnel complexes provided shelter from artillery and tactical fighter bombers. But the B-52 negated all of it. It did not need to find the tunnel entrance. It simply collapsed the entire tunnel system from above. It did not need to target the soldiers. It simply destroyed the patch of earth on which they stood. This was the initial shock. This was the first horrifying lesson. The Americans had a weapon that could delete a piece of the map, and they had an industrial capacity that meant they could do it again and again and again. The war of will was about to collide with a war of mathematics. The numbers told the story. They told a story of an industrial logic so overwhelming that it bordered on the abstract. They told a story that rendered individual bravery and ideological fervor almost irrelevant. Let's consider the bomb. The standard high-explosive munition used by the B-52s was the M117, a 750-pound general-purpose bomb. A single B-52D, the workhorse of the Arclight missions, could carry 84 of these bombs in its internal bay and another 24 on external wing pylons. That is 108 bombs. A total of 81,000 pounds of high explosives, over 40 tons, from a single aircraft. A typical Arclight mission was not one aircraft. It was a cell of 3. That meant 324 bombs, 120 tons of explosives, delivered in less than 30 seconds. A larger raid could involve 18, 30, or even more aircraft. The tonnage becomes difficult to comprehend. Now, let us consider the frequency. Between 1965 and 1973, B-52s flew 126,615 combat sorties. Let that number settle. 126,615 times, these aircraft delivered their payloads over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The total weight of munitions dropped by B-52s during the conflict was nearly 3 million tons. 2,949,677 tons, to be precise. To put this in perspective, the entire bomb tonnage dropped by the United States Army Air Forces in all of World War II, in every theater against Germany, Italy, and Japan, was approximately 21 million tons. A single type of aircraft, in a supposedly limited war, dropped nearly 1 million more tons of bombs than the entire American air effort in the largest war in human history. This was not warfare. This was an industrial process. Behind every sortie was a logistical chain of staggering complexity, a testament to American material abundance. The bombs themselves were manufactured in places like the Louisiana Army ammunition plant, then shipped by sea in vast quantities across the Pacific. At Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and Utapao Royal Thai Air Base in Thailand, sprawling bomb farms were created. Acres upon acres of land were covered with neat stacks of M117S and Mk-82s, baking in the tropical sun, waiting to be loaded. Specialized crews, working around the clock, used hydraulic lifts and conveyor systems to pack the bomb bays of the giant aircraft. Each B-52 required a crew of 6. It required hundreds of ground crew for maintenance. It consumed thousands of gallons of jet fuel per hour. Its missions often required the support of a fleet of KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft for aerial refueling. Each of those tankers had its own crew, its own fuel requirements, its own maintenance schedule. This entire ecosystem of men and material was dedicated to a single purpose: picking up colossal amounts of manufactured steel and high explosive from one point on the globe and depositing it onto another. The target itself was almost incidental. For the crews flying at 30,000 feet, the war was an abstraction. It was a set of coordinates, a radar blip, a sequence of switches to be flipped. They rarely saw the ground. They never saw the enemy. They were technicians in a flying factory, executing a production schedule. Contrast this with the logistical reality of their enemy. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a triumph of human ingenuity and endurance. It was a network of jungle paths, hidden roads, and river crossings. Supplies were moved south by aging Soviet trucks, by bicycle, by ox cart, and on the backs of tens of thousands of porters. A bag of rice, a box of ammunition, a single mortar tube. Each item was a precious commodity, painstakingly transported over hundreds of miles of brutal terrain under constant threat of attack. The North Vietnamese soldier cherished his rifle. He counted his bullets. He knew that every resource was hard-won. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to possess a casual, almost wasteful abundance. They could pave over a square mile of jungle with bombs simply on the suspicion that a few dozen enemy soldiers might be hiding there. The numbers told a story of two different worlds, two different centuries, engaged in the same conflict. One side fought with scarcity-driven desperation. The other fought with abundance-driven strategy. And the B-52 Stratofortress was the ultimate expression of that abundance. It was the crushing, undeniable, mathematical proof of the gap between the two worlds. The avalanche of statistics, however, can obscure the human reality. The war was not fought by numbers, but by people. And for the people on the receiving end of those 3 million tons of bombs, the experience was visceral, personal, and transformative. Truong New Tang, a senior Viet Cong official, left a searing account in his memoir of surviving a B-52 raid. He was in a command bunker deep in the jungle when the attack began. From the southwest, a monstrous sound, a deafening roar, seemed to be coming directly at us, he wrote. It was the terrifying sound of B-52s. The terror was in the sound itself, a sound that seemed to suck all the air from the sky, to flatten the jungle and swamp the senses. He described the chaos as the bombs walked across their position. The ground beneath us began to heave. It was as if we were on a gigantic trampoline. In the bunker, we were tossed from one side to the other. There was nothing to do but lie on the floor, hug the earth, and pray. When he emerged, the world he knew was gone. The forest had been stripped bare, as if by a giant razor. The ground was a churned-up mass of mud and craters. The familiar landmarks were gone, and for a moment we were completely disoriented. This experience was repeated thousands of times. An NVA soldier named Luong was captured after his unit was hit. In his debriefing, he stated, "We were all terrified of the B-52s. When we heard the planes, we would run for the shelters. But sometimes the bombs would fall right on the shelters and kill everyone inside. We never saw the planes, we only heard the bombs. It was like being attacked by ghosts." The psychological weapon was as potent as the high explosive. The B-52 induced a feeling of utter helplessness. Against a fighter bomber, a soldier could shoot back, or at least feel the satisfaction of seeing his enemy. He could dive into a foxhole when he heard the plane approach. But the B-52 was invisible. Its bombs arrived without warning. There was no defense. There was no counterattack. There was only submission to a random, overwhelming force. The strikes became a form of psychological attrition, grinding down the morale and resolve of even the most hardened soldiers. The very jungle, once a source of comfort and protection, became a terrifying trap, as any patch of it could become a target at any moment. For the American ground soldier, the B-52 was the polar opposite. It was not a ghost. It was a guardian angel. It was salvation arriving as a distant, rolling thunder. For a platoon of Marines pinned down by a machine gun nest, for an Army patrol about to be overrun, the call for an arc-light strike was a final, desperate plea. The process was relayed up the chain of command to strategic planners thousands of miles away. Hours might pass. Then, the word would come back down, arc-light inbound. The American troops would pull back to a safe distance, a line on the map beyond which lay oblivion. They would hunker down and wait. First came the silence. Then, the low rumble. The ground would begin to tremble, the vibrations traveling for miles through the earth. The sky would light up with colossal flashes, even in broad daylight. And then the sound would arrive, a physical wave of pressure that hit them in the chest. When it was over, there was only silence. A deafening, profound silence where once there had been the chaos of battle. The Americans would advance back into the target box. What they found was a landscape from another planet. The enemy positions were gone. The machine gun nests were gone. The soldiers who had manned them were gone, vaporized, or buried under tons of earth. For the American grunt, the B-52 was the ultimate proof that, no matter how bad things got on the ground, they were part of a system with terrifying, decisive power. It was a reassurance that their country could, and would, move heaven and earth to protect them. The experience for the B-52 crews remained surreal, detached. A pilot on a mission from Thailand described his routine. "We'd have breakfast at the officers' club, get our briefing, and then walk out to this massive airplane. We'd climb in, go through the checklist, and take off. For the next few hours, we were an airline crew. We refueled. We navigated by instruments. The bombardier navigator would handle the bomb run using radar. We'd get a tone in our headsets when the bombs were released. Then we'd make a slow turn and fly home. We'd land, debrief, and go have a beer. We never saw a thing. We were fighting a war by remote control." This disconnect was central to the B-52's character in Vietnam. It was an impersonal weapon, wielded by technicians against an enemy they would never see, to save soldiers they would never meet. It was the cold, hard logic of industrial warfare, distilled into a 6-man crew flying 10 hours to deliver 40 tons of death with mathematical precision. Nowhere was this industrial logic more clearly or brutally demonstrated than at the siege of Khe Sanh. In early 1968, General Giap sought to replicate his legendary victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu. He surrounded the remote Marine combat base at Khe Sanh with an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 NVA regulars. The 6,000 Marines inside were cut off, besieged, and subjected to constant artillery and mortar fire. Giap's plan was clear: lure the Americans into a set-piece battle, crush them with massed infantry assaults, and deliver a humiliating defeat that would shatter American morale back home. He had chosen the ground. He had the numerical superiority. He was confident that the revolutionary will of his soldiers would overwhelm the defenders. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had failed to account for the B-52. The American response was Operation Niagara, a 77-day aerial campaign of unprecedented intensity. And at its heart was the Stratofortress. The strategy was simple and brutal: to turn the hills surrounding Khe Sanh into a killing ground, to use air power not just to support the Marines, but to physically annihilate the besieging army. The B-52s came around the clock. Every 90 minutes, a new three-plane cell would arrive on station. They were guided by ground-based radar, a system called Combat Sky Spot, which allowed for pinpoint accuracy even through the dense monsoon clouds that often shrouded the battlefield. The Marines in their bunkers couldn't see the planes, but they could set their watches by them. The NVA had spent months digging extensive trench systems, bunkers, and tunnels in the hills around the base. The B-52s erased them. A single raid could obliterate an entire section of trench line, burying hundreds of soldiers in an instant. Troop concentrations massing for an assault would simply vanish in a rolling carpet of explosions. Supply dumps were vaporized. Command and control centers were pulverized. During the 77-day siege, B-52s flew 2,548 sorties and dropped 59,542 tons of bombs in the immediate vicinity of the base. Tactical aircraft added another 40,000 tons. The total, nearly 100,000 tons of explosives on a battlefield just a few square miles in size, represented the most concentrated application of aerial firepower in the history of warfare. The NVA soldiers were trapped in a hellscape. Their own captured diaries and the testimony of prisoners told a story of utter demoralization. They were not being defeated by the Marines, whom they rarely saw. They were being systematically dismantled by an unseen, unstoppable force that rained death from the sky. One captured NVA officer told his interrogators, "I have been in the Army for 13 years. I have fought in many battles, but I have never seen anything like Khe Sanh. The bombs never stopped. We could not eat. We could not sleep. We could only hide in our holes and pray. The American planes have turned the hills into a sea of fire." General Giap's strategy, predicated on massed infantry, was rendered obsolete and suicidal. The siege was broken not by a ground assault, but by the relentless, industrial application of high explosives. Khe Sanh was not a victory of Marine bravery, though that was undeniable. It was a victory of American logistics. It was a victory of the B-52. Giap, in a post-war analysis, admitted his profound underestimation of American air power. He had planned for a battle against soldiers. He found himself in a battle against factories. The ideological collapse was profound. The myth of the invincible guerrilla, sustained by revolutionary fervor, had shattered against the hard reality of the bomb tonnage charts. The war, it was now clear, would not be won by the side that was more willing to die. It would be won by the side that was more able to kill. If Khe Sanh was the application of the B-52 as a battlefield destroyer, Operation Linebacker II was its use as a strategic political instrument. By late 1972, peace talks in Paris had stalled. President Richard Nixon, frustrated with North Vietnamese intransigence, decided to deliver a final, shocking blow to force them back to the negotiating table. He would unleash the full power of the B-52s not on jungle sanctuaries or remote battlefields, but on the very heart of North Vietnam, the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. It was a decision of immense political risk. The bombing of civilian-adjacent areas was guaranteed to provoke international condemnation. The air defenses around Hanoi were the most formidable on the planet, a dense network of Soviet-made SA-2 surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. Sending the subsonic B-52s into that environment was a terrifying gamble. On December 18, 1972, the Christmas bombings began. For 11 straight days, with a brief pause for Christmas Day, waves of B-52s, flying primarily from Guam and Thailand, struck targets around the clock. The targets were strategic: rail yards, power plants, communication centers, airfields, and SAM sites. The goal was to paralyze North Vietnam's ability to wage war and to shatter the leadership's belief that they could wait out the Americans indefinitely. The first few nights were brutal for the American crews. The North Vietnamese fired over 1,000 SAMs. Their missile crews were skilled, and their tactics were effective. 9 B-52s were shot down in the first 3 days. But the American military adapted. They changed their tactics, their routes of approach, their altitudes, and their use of electronic countermeasures. Waves of F-4 Phantoms and F-111s flew ahead of the bombers to suppress the SAM sites. What the North Vietnamese discovered was another grim mathematical reality. They had a finite number of missiles. The Americans had a seemingly infinite number of bombs. As the days wore on, the American tactics improved and the North Vietnamese missile stocks dwindled. The B-52s began to strike with impunity. Over the course of the 11-day campaign, 729 B-52 sorties dropped over 15,000 tons of bombs on the Hanoi and Haiphong areas. The damage to North Vietnam's industrial and military infrastructure was catastrophic. Their entire air defense system was on the verge of collapse. The message was unambiguous and undeniable. We can do this for as long as it takes. We can, and will destroy your entire country from the air. On December 29th, the North Vietnamese leadership signaled their readiness to return to Paris for talks. The bombing stopped. On January 23, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The concession was complete. While the political legacy of Linebacker II remains controversial, its strategic effect was clear. It was coercive air power in its purest form. The North Vietnamese leadership, who for years had absorbed everything the American military could throw at them, finally capitulated when faced with the systematic, industrial-scale destruction of their heartland by the B-52. Their will had not been broken by a decade of fighting in the South, but it was bent to the breaking point by 11 days of overwhelming, undeniable firepower delivered to their front door. The story of the B-52 in Vietnam is the story of a fundamental clash of philosophies. It was a war between an ideology of romantic, revolutionary struggle and an ideology of cold, calculated, industrial power. The North Vietnamese believed in the power of the human spirit to overcome material disadvantage. They believed that with enough patience, sacrifice, and tactical ingenuity, they could defeat a technologically superior foe. What they encountered in the B-52 was a force that operated outside that paradigm. The Stratofortress was the ultimate symbol of a system that could substitute mass-produced firepower for ground-level risk, a system that could solve a tactical problem by simply deleting the grid square in which it existed. It was a weapon that didn't defeat its enemy in the traditional sense. It buried them under a mountain of steel. It rendered their tactics obsolete, their sanctuaries untenable, and their ideology questionable. The jungle offered no sanctuary. The tunnels offered no escape. The will of the soldier, no matter how iron, could not withstand the unblinking logic of the assembly line. The final numbers remained staggering, a monument to the scale of the undertaking. 126,615 sorties. 2,949,677 tons of bombs. More than the entire American effort in the Second World War. 15 B-52s lost in combat over North Vietnam during Linebacker II, with 33 crewmen killed or missing. The cost in dollars ran into the billions. But the true legacy is written not in ledgers, but in the very soil of Southeast Asia. To this day, farmers in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia still uncover the unexploded ordnance from those raids, a deadly inheritance from a war fought from 30,000 feet. The landscape in places like the Plain of Jars and Laos remains a moonscape, pockmarked with countless craters, a permanent scar from the sheer weight of metal that fell from the sky. In the end, the North Vietnamese did not surrender. They outlasted the American political will to continue the conflict, and ultimately, they won their war. But they did so at a terrible cost, a cost inflicted in large part by this one machine. They learned a brutal lesson, a lesson that would echo through the future warfare. They learned that courage is not enough. They learned that ideology is not a shield. They learned that in a conflict against an industrial superpower, the enemy is not the soldier you face, but the factory that arms him, the logistical chain that supplies him, and the awesome, terrible power that can be brought to bear from a place you cannot see and can never reach. The sound that began as a distant, curious rumble in the jungles of War Zone C had, by the end, become the defining soundtrack of the war. It was the sound of overwhelming power. It was the sound of inevitable destruction. It was the sound of an industrial nation imposing its will, one 40-ton payload at a time. It is a sound that still echoes in the memory and in the very landscape of a nation that learned the hard way that some forces of history are too big to fight and can only be endured.